Thank you so much, Sister Joan. I don't think I'll be able to live up to that, but I'll do my best, okay? As I started working on this presentation, a few weeks ago, and then I put it aside and did something else, all right? And then I changed things up a little bit, as I'll explain in a minute. But I couldn't help but observe in the course of my research that so much of what I was reading around in, all right? I'm well known for reading around in a scattered fashion. Sage advice offered to me years ago by my mentor at Notre Dame, Philip Gleason, right? But all of these themes resonate here at Ohio Dominican above and beyond the common good theme chosen for this year, right? In the courses taught by my many faculty brethren, as we all reflect on the common good in a special way this academic year, right? When I looked at the assignment of American political thought, I checked out a syllabus of my esteemed colleague and good friend, Dr. Karsten's, and noted we teach some of the same ideas. His focuses on the concept of nature, American exceptionalism, which I explore in my U.S. foreign policy class. So realizing that I would be ill-advised to try to match the Karsten's thunder and insight, especially after spending a good deal of time reading his extensive syllabus, I decided to shift my focus a bit, right? I'll still do what I was charged to do, right? But I was fortified when this 90th anniversary of Commonweal, all right, one of my favorite Catholic but very ecumenical magazines, journals of opinion, written for scholarly people and the not so scholarly. It arrived, and I thought, once again, you've been reading around in that, put some of this together, right? So my perspective will come, as Sister Joan said, from the viewpoint of a scholar or a professor of American religious history, both ecumenical as well as Catholic, in keeping with the spirit and values of the Sisters of St. Mary of the Springs, now the Dominican Sisters of Peace, who founded this institution more than a century ago. Commonweal's editors in this magazine focus on two faiths, exploring the foundation of the Catholic but very ecumenical review of religion, politics, and culture. This magazine was founded in the aftermath and as a consequence of the First World War. Many universities across the continental United States are commemorating this in some fashion, right? And we reflect on how the Great War continues to affect our world today in a profound sense when world peace remains threatened on so many fronts. Michael Williams, the founding editor of Commonweal, had been working with the National Catholic War Council so Catholics could prove their patriotism during World War I. A major theme today is that Catholics' patriotism was often, and in some cases still is, in question, right? And after the war, all right, seeing the success of Catholics using the NCWC to prove their patriotism, they morphed it into the National Catholic Welfare Council and took up the interests of social justice, all right, once the war ended. The American Catholic community faced the challenge and opportunity, once again, of how to prove their loyalty to a country at a time when they were still eyed with suspicion by the Protestant majority. When it came to war, the editorialist in this magazine, would Catholics take their orders from the president or the Pope? When Catholics rallied to Wilson's call to arms, fighting in the trenches to prove their loyalty, much of the native prejudice and suspicion was allayed. It'll pop up again periodically, all right? A theme which students in my History of Christianity course are about to study once we make our way through the intrigue of the Americanist heresy crisis at the end of the 19th century. Commonweal explored the underappreciated Catholic wellsprings of the American nation, right? The underappreciated Catholic wellsprings of the American nation. The editors at that time insist that a certain religious piety, an outlook rooted in a larger transcendent hope, not only went hand in hand with democracy's celebration of the common man, but was crucial to forging consensus about the common good in a pluralistic society, all right? So that theme of the common good still resonates, right? As far as the editors were concerned, the Declaration of Independence's bold assertion that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, rested on bedrock Catholic principles, right? The Catholics were always trying to prove their loyalty, so we are Catholics, but we are all also good Americans, regarding the inherent value and dignity of every human life. A democratic republic that honored this principle would flourish, one that neglected it would founder and fall by the wayside, right? Liberal democracy, very much in retreat between the 2 centuries' world wars, received little encouragement from the church in its struggles with authoritarian forces. Yet commonweal, kind of on the liberal side or the left wing, I read the right wing ones too, right, refused to abandon its belief in either democracy or Catholic truth. They were not, it's not an either or choice, it's a both and, right? Consistently arguing that in the modern world, the health of one was very much related to the health of another. If the magazine has been guided in the past 90 years by one principle, it's that democracy and Catholicism need not be antagonists, but should be partners, right? Under the rubric of the American political tradition. The church has something to learn from American democracy about institutional accountability. Catholicism still has much to teach the modern world about justice, the limitations of individualism, and the sanctity of life. In Vatican II's Declaration on Religious Freedom, the Church finally conceded as much, vindicating our conviction that political and religious freedom are both inalienable aspects of human dignity, right? Notice how the words of some of these editorials in the Catholic magazine over the years echo the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers, all right? So there's a good deal of overlap here, which is the point I want to make it, and I'll leave it now in a minute. Yet the church continues to remind us that our fates as individuals are forever intertwined in dedicating ourselves to the common weal, right? Title of the magazine, the happiness, health, and safety of all the people of the community or nation, the general welfare, which appears in our nation's founding documents. We direct our lives toward a meaning that we would otherwise neglect, right? The philosopher Michael Sandel has written, we can know a good in common that we cannot know alone, right? We can seek the truth in common that we can't do so well alone. Catholics believe that more transcendent truths are something we must come to know together, and that the two faiths in democracy and the Catholic faith must continue to complement and nourish one another, right? So that's where I'm going to go off a little bit as opposed to the straight American political tradition that Dr. Karstens does so well in his class, right? The concept of the common good can be traced back to the ancient philosophers, as Sister Joan pointed out. In both Greece and Rome, the context of politics, religion, and philosophy, right? And our understanding of the common good along the lines of that which benefits society as a whole, with an emphasis on the good of the larger community rather than the individual or interest group, right? We can see this when we start down the road, as I do at the beginning of every fall semester with the History 201 students, right? Our nation's founding document, the Declaration of Independence, written on a wing and a prayer in the midst of the Revolutionary War by Thomas Jefferson and his founding brothers. Right? My students have just had to read a book called Founding Brothers. There might be a couple of you here. Right? The words, which should be familiar to every child in school, but which sadly are no longer, form the basis of our American political thought. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary, not a whim or an option, for one people to dissolve the political bands necessitating and justifying the unprecedented Revolutionary War and leap into the dark of independence, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. You can chant along with me if you know, right? But I won't take offense if you don't. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And then Jefferson veers off into a laundry list of charges against the king, some of which are way over the top, all right? But the Declaration of Independence is also a piece of propaganda in the best sense, right? And the concluding crescendo of the Declaration, and for the support of this Declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. The common good implied there rather than stated overtly, right? After the period of the Articles of Confederation, the first government, which failed miserably, right, Constitution was Plan B, right? And these words of common good resonate in so many of our founding documents. John Adams, government is instituted for the common good, protection, safety, prosperity, and happiness of the people, not for profit, honor, or private interest, right? In the Federalist Papers, Madison, the Federalist Papers written to effect the ratification cause, even after the Constitution was written, there was no guarantee that the required number of states would accept it. So the brilliant writers and propagandists, right, wrote a series of papers which remain the foundation of much of our insights into government and the legalities of the United States. Federalist number 10. Madison talks about the latent causes of faction, difference, parties, are sown into the nature of man. We see them everywhere. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion and government, right? And many other points, as well as speculation as of practice, an attachment to different leaders, right? All of these come down to what he says, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for the common good, right? Madison meant what he said, and then he formed the first opposition party shortly thereafter, right? In Federalist number 57, the aim of every political constitution is or ought to be first, to obtain for rulers men who possessed most wisdom to discern and most virtue to pursue the common good, right? Jefferson's first inaugural, Madison's partner in the founding of the opposition party, right? Being now decided, once he defeated his former best friend Adams in his bid for re-election, right? Now he has to say we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans, right? Being now decided by the voice of the nation, announced according to the rules of the Constitution, all will, of course, arrange themselves under the will of the law, united in common efforts for the common good, right? Lincoln, right? I'm jumping around with the presidents, but we don't have that much time, right? Many good presidents in between, but Lincoln, in the moment of our gravest national crisis, the Civil War, and some of the most memorable words ever written. I encourage all of you to go home tonight, won't take you more than 20 minutes, all right, and read the Gettysburg Address in the second inaugural for solace and comfort in the midst of whatever woe we perceive we are in now, and compare it to what Lincoln was up against, right? Lincoln, in one of his many letters, which have all been collected, spoke of the common good in this context, right? Honor to the soldier and sailor everywhere who bravely bears his country's cause. Honor to the citizen who cares for his brother in the field and serves as he best can the same cause. Honor to him, only less than to him, who braves for the common good the storms of heaven and the storms of battle, right? Lincoln, not known at the beginning for his religiosity or piety, right, in the depths of the Civil War, turned to God more frequently, right? And by the incomparable, moving way ahead, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, if PBS is any indication, continues to fascinate us as a people alongside his cousin Teddy, even though Teddy is from the Republican branch of the family, right? And on Constitution Day in 1937, FDR spoke about rejoicing in the wisdom of the Constitution, asking the people to have faith in its ultimate capacity to work out the problems of democracy. I ask they give their loyalty to the Constitution and not to its misinterpreters, all right? The Supreme Court declared some of his New Deal legislation invalid, all right? I ask that majorities and minorities subordinate intolerance and power alike to the common good, right? So if you look carefully, you can find the common good popping up everywhere, right? at the John F. Kennedy Library. All right, I have to work my favorite president in here, and the Catholic president as well. All right, Kennedy's inaugural address reflected his core beliefs and life experience. Right, he had read the great speeches of the ages, believing in the power of words. He thought that a democracy thrives only when citizens contribute their talents to the common good, and that it is up to leaders to inspire citizens to acts of sacrifice. All right? So you can look from the beginning of the country up and through the 60s. All right? I might have looked for George Bush, but I chose not to, or Obama, too recent. All right. Not bipartisan, but too recent, all right? So if we look at this American political thought, all right, and then if I can just segue to what I thought would be best for me to focus on today, the common good at the intersection of politics and religion, right? We always hear politics and religion don't mix, all right? They mix all the time, not always very with the greatest amount of courtesy, right? But religion and politics have been intertwined, even if the founding fathers, many of whom, and there's still a lot of debate about this, were deists and believers in an Enlightenment type of philosophy rather than going to a Christian church, right? But there was this intersection of politics and religion, which can provide some insight today, I think, into the current strained state of politics we see, with the hope that civility might be restored and prevail, but maybe not before Election Day, right? Through the prism of my own research, I've seen Catholics depicted as misfits, threats to democracy throughout our history, given their reputation for blindly following authority, particularly the Pope, right? The history of anti-Catholicism or nativism might be the topic of a future lecture, right? But this notion that Catholics blindly do whatever the Pope tells them, right? Many in Rome today or in recent decades would be incredulous at this notion, right? Because the American Catholics are, stirring up some protest on various issues, right? Some of American Catholics' leading intellectuals and social reformers' life stories, very briefly, might shed some light on how they too tried to make their way into the mainstream to prove their patriotism to their country by emphasizing what united them with their fellow citizens, Catholics and Protestants, Catholics and Jews at this point in time, later on adding Muslims, Buddhists, etc. All right, so focusing on what united Catholics with their fellow citizens rather than what divided them, and the nativist anti-Catholic hostility, right? In the process of proving their loyalty to America, they were also able to make invaluable contributions to their country as well as their church, inspired by their faith in the propositions that are all hold in common, right? And I'm going to do this very quickly, but I have to acknowledge that I'm much indebted here to Patrick Carey's book on American Catholic religious thought, a resource rich in primary writings and documents, as well as his insightful commentaries, right? From the beginning, right, when the Catholic minority set up shop in Maryland in the 17th century and immediately drafted a proclamation on religious toleration, right? Which meant Catholics are more tolerant than everyone else. True or false? I'd like to think it's true, right? And I would agree, all right? But the Catholic minority passed the act of religious toleration because they knew they were in a sea of hostile people, right? It was a smart move, right? And then the Catholic Church was first led by John Carroll, and throughout our history, starting with John Carroll, the Carols of Carrollton, Catholics have focused on apologetics, not an apology for being Catholics. My students sometimes ask me, they're apologizing? I said, no. Apologetics was the way to go in a mainstream or majority Protestant nation, all right? And apologetics was a reasonable and intellectual defense of the Catholic faith to break through the misunderstandings and find that common ground or common good. John Carroll, in the context of Enlightenment ideology, the same time that Jefferson and the Founding Fathers are dealing with these issues, advocated, much to the surprise of people who study this, religious liberty, voluntarism, separation of church and state, which certainly wasn't the case in Europe, right? In some respects, right? And American republicanism, right? The Catholics had to show that they were compatible with the government, and Carroll built a firm foundation for his Catholic minority in Baltimore and saw it expand successfully in other dioceses. Some of his dreams, to show that he's a man ahead of his time, he advocated a liturgy in the vernacular, right? That the Catholics in the United States, rather than always using Latin, should use English, right? That didn't go over well, right? But the Second Vatican Council fixed that in the 1960s. His contemporary, less well known, John England, Bishop of Charleston, actually framed a constitution for governing his diocese, right? Trying to fit in and also take what was good in the American government, right? John England's philosophy, when in Rome, do as the Romans, but when in the United States, right? Try to step in line without compromising your principles, right? He demonstrated that it was possible for Catholics to be governed in a style compatible with republicanism, right? Our nation was not founded as a democracy, but as a republic, right? Having nothing to do with the Democrat and Republican parties, right? All the while, England was very well known, Bishop England, for modeling the compatibility of faith and reason, right? And we go all the way back to the Dominicans in the 13th century for that. In the Romantic Age, American Catholicism's leading converts and intellectual lights, less well known perhaps to many of you, Orestes Brownson and Isaac Hecker, raised the intellectual reputation of the church at a time when they traveled in the same circles as the great literary figures. Brook Farm, they hung out at Brook Farm, they befriended transcendentalists, right? They were very well connected. These converts demonstrated that Catholics possessed impressive intellectual credentials and talents. Both of these men were seekers, and they joined, between them, 30 or 40 different religious denominations. They tried everything on, nothing fit, right? And much to the chagrin of the nativists at the time, finally found their permanent home in the Catholic Church, right? To some, they thought that they had lost their senses, right? But both served the Catholic Church and the American Republic that they loved very well. Brownson earned a well-deserved reputation as the foremost intellectual layman of his age. He was a publisher of Brownson's Quarterly Review, very highly rated journal, read by Catholics and non-Catholics alike. Isaac Hecker, right, who they were both traveling around in the same circles, but neither one admitted to the other that they were leaning in the direction of Catholicism, right? I think they were afraid, right? But they found common cause again when they both converted to Catholicism, right? Isaac Hecker went a step further, or a different direction than Brownson. He became a priest and later founded the first American congregation of priests, the Missionary Society of St. Paul, or the Paulists, right? Any of you who attend Mass over at Ohio State may have met a Paulist or two along the way, all right? Hecker developed a style of apologetics for Catholicism that tried to correlate the interior, searching questions and needs of the man and his age with the external answers and workings of the Catholic Church. Both Hecker and Brownson were dreamers, right? Both had the goal of converting all of the United States of America to Catholicism, right? So should we forget them because they failed, right? Or should we admire them for what they accomplished, right? I come in on the second point, all right? Hecker was a dreamer, but a serious and committed one, dedicated to the proposition of converting the American nation through the workings of the Holy Spirit. Right? And finally, the last two figures I want to look at real quickly, in the 20th century, an era of neo-Thomism in the context of burgeoning Catholic culture, right? The leading lights and two of my personal favorites, right? If you're given a charge to give a lecture without too many constrictions, you can focus on some of your favorites. Dorothy Day and John Courtney Murray, right? Dorothy Day might be familiar to you more than John Courtney Murray. Day, founder of the Catholic worker movement, presents us with a life story which is perennially fascinating and intriguing. She was a journalist and a socialist who flirted with communism as well during the dark days of the Depression. And she came out on the other side as a convert to Catholicism, right? What is it about all these converts, right? Her movement, both a newspaper and a social reform organization, the Catholic Worker, remains a national movement today. After her death, the cause of her canonization, despite her checkered past, remains active today. Hope springs eternal for all of us. Her heroic virtue and work in comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. I hope Fulton Sheen gets there first for personal reasons, but her example, right, reached far beyond Catholicism, but that's where she found her final home, right? She took care of the poor and the homeless, the least among us, according to the gospel imperative, and her version of Christian personalism was not individual, but communitarian, right? Focused on the common good. Her programs and aims at the houses of hospitality were on the corporal works of charity and mercy, social justice. She built many bridges across religious and political aisles through her tireless work, right, and frequent jail sentences for her protests against war, poverty. If you've never studied Dorothy Day, look for some pictures and see her being dragged away by the police, a white-haired old woman, right, and doing it time after time, right? This was a woman committed to the common good with an emphasis on the least among us, right? And the last figure in both an American and a religious, from an American and a religious perspective, John Courtney Murray, right? And I'm quoting directly from Professor Carey today because he says it better than I could. He is the best American Catholic exemplar of dedication to the common good, as well as the principal American champion and theoretician of religious liberty. When I mentioned before that Carol thought it would be a good idea to have Mass and preaching in English rather than Latin so as not to draw so much attention to what was different between Catholic and Protestants, right? He has to wait to the Second Vatican Council to fulfill that idea, or his idea has to wait. John Courtney Murray was instrumental, right, in bringing the American Catholic Church center stage in the Universal Church at the Second Vatican Council, all right? Having been silenced early in his academic career for, treading in these waters, separation of church and state. He was the chief advisor and author of the Declaration on Religious Liberty during the Second Vatican Council. After World War II, Murray saw an opportunity for Catholics to cooperate with fellow Christians and Jews in attacking the social crises of the era. He had to overcome suspicion of Catholic political goals. Even though the Catholics had made great strides since the time of Carroll, there was still that suspicion. In troubled times, anti-Catholicism pops up again. So he had to overcome the suspicion before this cooperation was possible. The perennial problem in the relationship between American Catholics under the American political umbrella. He also had to refute a secularist interpretation of separation of church and state that relegated religion to the sacristy or the private sphere of individual conscience, right? Think of an image, even if you don't have a picture of him in your mind, of the best balancing act between American political thought and Catholic teaching. His most famous book was published in 1960, We Hold These Truths, all right? Echoing our founding documents, Catholic Reflections on the American Proposition, which I've used several times before in this talk. And he argued, in keeping with the spirit of the common good, that the American doctrine of religious liberty is a political and not a religious proposition, right? Check the Bill of Rights, and he's going to add to this, and that assent to the First Amendment is grounded on moral principle and public philosophy rather than on religious belief and theology. Again, what unites us rather than what divides us. He demonstrated that the freedom of religion guaranteed by the Constitution provides for the possibility of religious integrity as well as civil and political unity. The common good, the wisdom and validity of this constitutional provision is grounded in and has been tested since by the American experience, right? But his was a great achievement at the time of the 1960s when the first Catholic president was elected and the Second Vatican Council is going on, right? A fine day to be a Catholic in America, right? And now for the final portion of my talk, from a more current perspective, right? And I didn't intend to do this originally, but the Commonweal said, look around and explore some more contemporary things which might be of interest to students and others present here on a more voluntary basis today, right? So I'd like to reflect on some of the discussions of the common good through a wider angle, all right? As Sister Joan said, I'm a historian, mostly of American religion. My specialty is American Catholicism. But in an ecumenical fashion, I teach a class here currently, the history of Christianity in the United States, all right? So Protestants and Catholics, all right? I do work the Jews and other religious communities in as we, cross the decades. But I turn to Martin Marty, historian of American religion par excellence, and author of 2 books, well, he's the author of 20 or 30 books, right, which directly explore the theme of today, the one and the many, America's struggle for the common good, 1997, all right? It's not always easy, right? We have to struggle and always work and dedicate ourselves to the common good, right? A second book published in 2000 along these lines, Politics, Religion, and the Common Good, advancing a distinctly American conversation about religion's role in our shared life, right? So welcoming, so communitarian, right? Professor Marty, an ordained Lutheran minister, is both an award-winning historian, a featured speaker on television, talking head historian at times of religious news on many matters religious. A few years ago, he graced us with his presence on campus when Dr. Todd was the vice president for academic affairs. I think he was her advisor, but I remember him being here at that time. My students, right, in History Theology 342 know him well because we use his textbook in my class, right? In these 2 works of his, he emphasizes the Latin motto on the Great Seal of the United States, E pluribus unum, right? We see today that this phrase, out of many one from many, has developed, and this is what he writes on in the 21st century, into one of almost shattering controversy, right? Watch television, right? Tune in to Fox News and then tune in to CNN and see how civil the conversation is today, right? So he's trying to say, let's emphasize again, out of many one, what unites us rather than divides us, all right? How are we to balance the conflicting claims today of inclusiveness and multiculturalism, right? Catholics wanted to be included. They were, right? Different ethnic groups over time in American history want to be included, right? And now, since the 60s, for a variety of reasons, we also want to celebrate our differences, right? So where do we draw the line, right? Those who insist on their separate identities, argues Marty, promote their own mutually exclusive subcultures at the expense of the common weal, right? Common weal, common good, all right? I found that several times in my research, or repetitive. It is often said that we are living through an era which has produced a shock to the body politic, a trauma in our culture, and a paralysis, all right, based on these hard-fought differences, not always in a polite fashion, right? Marty asks how we as a nation can focus on our common stories, right? And this is especially relevant for those of you who are teachers or planning a career in teaching. How can we focus on our common stories, what unites us, as we educate the next generation, rather than focusing on these bitter, divisive debates, remaining true to the Founding Fathers' dedication to the common good, right? Even as they form their factions and political parties against their own best judgment, right, but fallible human beings, right, they focused on the common good. Look at the controversies today in education over curriculum, the current debate over the standards of the AP history exam. All right, I tried to bring this up with my students, right? What should the political emphasis be? Which interest groups are in? Which are out in today's world, right? Again, focus on what unites us, all right? And shouldn't, Marty asks, a single grand narrative, an inclusive one, apply to all citizens? How can we, in this current climate, restory the history of the American Republic, American political thought in conjunction with American religious beliefs, all right? How has the notion of the common good developed or shifted over time, right? Historians have often explored these issues from the perspective of civil religion, also known as the religion of the Republic, right? Robert Bella's books were once distributed and taught here in the heyday of our humanities program, right? Old historians always look back, right? To try and keep their memory alive, right, for no other reason. But the religion of the Republic, tracing the views through the eyes of leading figures in American history, Puritan John Winthrop's idea or image of a city upon a hill meant one thing in 1630 when he came over with his Puritan band of followers, another when employed by John F. Kennedy in 1960 as he left Massachusetts as a Catholic rather than a Puritan to take up the office of President of the United States, and another, right, in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan frequently, right, repetitively used the phrase, "We are a shining city upon the hill," right? He added shining to it, right? Marty concludes his discussions with no fast and true solutions to these pressing issues, just the advice to keep the conversation going, right? Which is what we are about here today and in this series in Ohio Dominican. In a more recent book, Marty also notes that our moral leaders, who are often our presidents, but not confined to presidents, Washington, Lincoln, Wilson, and FDR, attached God to their exhortation, all right, to reach out to a common good and a common discussion. In the Cold War era of Eisenhower, right, having survived the crucible of World War II, Congress inserted the words "under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance. They weren't there originally, right? They were added in the post-war religious revival. And Marty comes down on a not entirely satisfactory solution, as I mentioned before. Keeping the conversation going is our best bet to remain true to our professed devotion to the common good, right? Trying to find another non-Catholic voice, all right, I looked and I found a book by Jim Wallace, President and CEO, right? Corporate mentality creeps into religious organizations as well as higher education of sojourners, right? Anybody ever heard of sojourners? Okay. Christian ministry in Washington, D.C., which seeks to proclaim and practice the biblical call to integrate spiritual renewal with social justice. That's very ecumenical, right? In an essay in Time magazine, he asked plaintively, whatever happened to the common good? I'd like to say it is alive and well here, right? And I think that's true. He followed this up with a book in 2014 on God's side, what religion forgets and politics still hasn't learned about serving the common good, right? So we're a work in progress. We all have much work to do. And I'm still reading around in the book, right? But at one point in the little essay he wrote, all right, which was a preface to the book, there is an ancient idea we have lost, right? But can and should find again, and it is the common good, all right? From Aristotle, from others, all right? The need for a dialogue. Today, when our politics are so polarized, we can also look back to the origins of Christianity. The early church fathers, this is the rule of most perfect Christianity. Its most exact definition, its highest point is to seek the common good. for nothing can so make a person an imitator of Christ as caring for his neighbors, right? So wise counsel, good advice here. This notion of the common good, both religious and secular, goes back to Catholic social teaching, the Protestant social gospel, Judaism, Islam, and the American Constitution, all right? All together rather than separated, which says that the government should promote the general welfare, right? We've lost touch with this moral compass, in Washington today, which has been replaced, I couldn't agree more, by both strident ideology and money. Right? So we have to work a little politics in here. And he concludes, only by inspiring a spiritual and practical commitment to the common good can we work together to make common life better. Right? And one last voice here, right? E.J. Dionne, a columnist for the Washington Post, professor at Georgetown's Public Policy Institute, gave a keynote address 2 or 3 years ago on religious diversity and the common good. Over the course of our 200 plus years of American history, religious diversity has mushroomed or blossomed, right? He argues that religious freedom, tolerance, and pluralism also produce obligations, and it is entirely legitimate for religious citizens to bring their faith to the public square in a civil, conversational manner. We should revisit and revive the model, he says, right, of civil rights Christianity. Reverend Martin Luther King's approach was resolutely centered not on the defeat of his adversaries, and if anyone had reason, all right, to want to, or to have resentment, right, against these adversaries, it was Reverend King, right? His focus was on conversion to a new ethic, and the end being redemption and reconciliation, right? Dionne also spoke, it was in earlier this year, to the words of Pope Francis. We have to find a new balance, all right? When talking about the Catholics, it's always a good thing to work Pope Francis into the conversation, right? Otherwise, even the moral edifice, if we lose our balance of the church, is likely to fall like a house of cards, losing the freshness and fragrance of the gospel, the aroma of the gospel. Tradition and memory of the past must help us to have courage to open up new areas to God, right? So Pope Francis is encouraging all of us to study history. Dionne's most recent book, Our Divided Political Heart, The Battle for the American Idea, contains more thought on these questions and echoes the Holy Father's call for a new sense of balance, right? Reverend Robert McElroy, all right, actually auxiliary bishop of San Francisco, all right, when I was first asked to do this, I put it aside, didn't even think about it for a while. It was summertime, right? But I found an essay in America, which I set aside, all right, and this is going to be my conclusion. I can tell you're wanting me to get to that point. But partisanship, conscience, and the common good, right? So many of the themes I've tried to explore now are contained in this, published in America in June of 2014, right? Catholic teaching views the vocation of politics as a vital element in building up the kingdom of God, right? Catholics are good at politics. Catholics fight like other non-Catholics in politics, right? But we finally made it into the mainstream after a 200-year struggle, all right? This vision of political life centers upon the concept of the common good, which the Second Vatican Council described as the sum total of social conditions which allow people to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily, whether as individuals or in groups. In seeking the common good, every group must take into account the needs and legitimate aspirations of every other group, and still more, of the human family as a whole, right? Political parties or factions, he reviews, right? He should teach History 201. As they preferred to call them, were antithetical to the pursuit of the common good, all right? The Founding Fathers didn't want factions. Well, factions we have, right? So we have to find a way to strike a good balance. In the most important crisis in our nation's history, he reminds us, political party structures have transformed and advanced the common good. Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party, finding a way in the crucible of the Civil War to find a way to emancipate the slaves, all right? That was a good party initiative. Political parties at their best, says Bishop McElroy, have the capacity to embody all the core principles of the church's social doctrine: subsidiarity, solidarity, the principle of the common good, human dignity, all right? These same themes echo the common good. In recent years, he says, can sometimes get lost in party ideology and the vituperative politics of today, all right? And once again, he advocates that we should focus on where to strike the balance, keeping the conversation going, right? And concludes, always a good idea, in the joy of the gospel. Pope Francis wrote, I ask God to give us more politicians capable of sincere and effective dialogue, focusing on the common good, aimed at healing the deepest roots and not simply the appearances of evils in our world. Let us pray and work to reform our political parties with that same aim, right? And this promise, final word, right, is echoed in Gaudium et Spes, which you are all reading in your 279 seminars, all right? I thought it appropriate to return to the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. These words ring as true today as they did at the time. In our day, profound changes are apparent in the structure and institutions of peoples. These result from their cultural, economic, and social evolution. Such changes have a great influence on the life of the political community, especially regarding the rights and duties of all in the exercise of civil freedom and the attainment of the good. Very good, all right. And in organizing the reflections of citizens among themselves and with respect to the public. Keep this in mind, all right, with the congressional elections coming up next month, all right. Keep it in mind with the next presidential election, all right. And during our question and conversation period, I hope, how we can come up with some ideas on how to best follow the advice, all right, to scrutinize the signs of our present times, all right, as the fathers of the Second Vatican Council did, and find solutions to some of these age-old questions and perennial challenges posed by our continued commitment to the common good. Thank you.